This chapter can be summed up into four major points. First being deculturization of African Americans. Second, segregation of African Americans not only in life but in school. Systematic slavery, which occurred after the abolishment of slavery, and integration into everyday life after slavery. The first major idea is deculturalization. Deculturalization is defined as the destruction of a culture of the dominated or minority group by the dominating group. Deculturalization of African Americans stems back to when slavery first started. When slave owners would purchase such slaves, they would first take away their names and then take away their entire culture as a whole, taking away their ability to read, ultimately naming the people slave A, B, C, or D, and by taking away their culture would cut off their entire gateway to the outside world, making them ultimately dependent upon the slave owner. The next major idea is segregation. Segregation is the enforced separation of different racial groups. Segregation became a part of everyday life after the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal was a just cause in the Plessy versus Ferguson court case. This led to absolutely everything being separate. Everything from schools all the way to restrooms were segregated until 1954 when the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional during the Brown versus Board of Education trial. Even after the trial ruled segregation unconstitutional, it wasn't a quick and speedy process that everything was equal again. As shown through the entire civil rights movement and even today, African Americans are still mistreated today through racial profiling and different forms of subtle discrimination, which usually aren't too subtle. The third main idea is systematic slavery. This wasn't really ever a national government idea, but was basically enacted by all of the white male landowners that had all the money in the United States. This was put in place after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was made, which was they abolished slavery, gave the rights to all people to be citizens, and then gave the rights to African American men to vote. Basically, this was the idea of that came from the grandfather clause. The grandfather clause was what it sounds like. If your grandfather voted, that means you had the right to vote. Well, for slaves, that couldn't have been possible because their grandfather was a slave. Another way this kept them from voting was they would have immense amounts of literacy tests to pass to go vote. Or they would say that you have to go down to the sheriff's office to vote. Well, no black male wanted to ever go to the sheriff's office for obvious reasons. The fourth major idea was integration. Integration really became big after the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that schools were really not separate but equal. It really proved that African Americans had inferior school districts as opposed to white Americans. As you can guess, this really was not smooth at all, leading to riots, police forces standing outside of a white schools that were supposed to be integrated, not letting blacks into the school. Ultimately, the beginning of integration was a failure. But over time, the blacks were allowed to be educated alongside the whites, and this led to the full integration of the United States. Even though now there may still be problems with the public school districts, but at least everyone has a fair shot at getting their own education in an equal environment now. Even after all that was said, I know that the United States as a whole is in a lot better shape than they were a couple hundred years ago. Even with all the civil rights movements that are still going on today, I know that there is way more opportunity for everyone in the United States today than there was before.